Welcome to Roots, War, and the Soul, Healing Through Story, a Virginia War Memorial live stream, learning from the home front. Since 1956, the Virginia War Memorial has been dedicated to the mission of honoring veterans, preserving history, educating youth, and inspiring patriotism in all. We hope you will enjoy today's presentation and continue your interest and support of the Virginia War Memorial's educational programs. Today, we are joined by acclaimed author Jennifer Holik. Jennifer is also a researcher, educator, empath, medium, and healer who is dedicated to uncovering 20th century military history. Thank you for joining us for this unique experience as we take a journey into the past through story. If you have a question during today's presentation, please feel free to submit your question using the chat feature throughout the presentation. They will be answered at the conclusion of the program. Now it is my pleasure to present Jennifer Holik.
Thank you, Jim. And welcome everybody to Roots, War, and the Soul, Healing Through Story. It is my intention today to take you on a journey through my stories with my military ancestors and some of my family members and some other people who've shown up to talk to you a little bit about military research and how researching their stories has helped me heal and helped me help others heal. Now, there's this great quote from the book Sarah's Key by Tatiana de Rosny. When a story is told, it is not forgotten. It becomes something else, the memory of who we were and the hope of what we can become. And I think this ties in a little bit with that phrase that goes something like, as long as we're saying their names, they will never be forgotten. And that is one thing that story does. The more we tell the stories, the more that these ancestors and these other people in our lives are remembered. And the more we are able to pass along the lessons from our families, the lessons we've learned in our own personal histories, and also at some point start to see the patterns that emerge. So we're going to start today with Robert and Ginny. Now, if you've ever heard me speak before and tell any of my military stories, you know, I will often say that my military career really began around 2010 when I first wrote Robert's book. But actually, it began in 1996 when I was finishing my college degree in history and had to do a family history project. And as I was gathering information on my family, my uncle brought this giant newspaper article to me with a picture of Robert. And he said, we had a family member that was a Flying Tiger, one of the original American volunteer group Flying Tigers. And he married a woman named Virginia, and he died shortly after they got married. Nobody knew what happened to Virginia. Well, I gathered a lot of information on that first visit. And it just so happened that my uncle, who showed me this article, had just retired and had plenty of time on his hands. Now, this is 1996, back before so many things were digitized on the internet. And he spent a lot of time in the Cicero and Berwyn libraries in the Chicago suburbs, doing a lot of microfilm newspaper research. And by the next time I saw him, he had over a 3-inch stack of newspapers all about Bob. Because when Bob came home from the Flying Tigers to resume his Army Air Corps service, he was Cicero and Chicago's hometown hero. Now, when I began researching Robert, I contacted the Flying Tiger Association. They were online in 1996. They still exist. And I started poking around on their message boards and asking, you know, did anybody remember Bob? Because he was killed so soon after the Flying Tigers disbanded. And a few pilots sent me letters and said, yes, I kind of remember him. And then I think our wives were pregnant at the same time. Well, they weren't. But after 60 years, memories get clouded and things change. So I took, you know, what I could prove from those letters and put the rest aside. At the time, the Flying Tiger Association was also giving the pilots, the crew, and everyone who served with them the Distinguished Flying Cross, because the government had finally acknowledged their service from 1941 into early 1942. Since nobody knew what happened to Robert's widow and nobody else in the family was doing any research, I asked if I could have his medal and citation, and it was given to me. Since then, because I have written Robert's book published it also in my book, Stories of the Lost. I talk about him. I've written about him on my websites. A lot of other family members and friends of family have come forward and said, hey, I've got his blood chit from his jacket when he was flying in China. I also have 8mm film of his Bob Rout Day parade, and I have pictures, and would you like it? And I always say yes. So the more we write our stories and we get them out into the world, you never know who's going to show up to help you and provide you with more information and artifacts. So what happened to Ginny? Well, in '96, as I said, I posted on those Flying Tiger message boards and kind of left it alone. Now, if you think these message boards never provide a lot of information, I would say just post on them anyway, because miracles happen. 9 years later, in 2005, just after I'd had my twins and one that just had heart surgery, Ginny's grandson saw my post on the Flying Tiger message boards, and she sent me an email. She's no longer on email, but at that time she was. And she said that she had recently lost her second husband, and to save herself from going into a deep depression, she chose to write her life's history. And I've seen this life history that she's written. She hand wrote every single page, and it's in these giant binders. And she put with the text photographs similar to this, and also documents and her memories. And she shared some of those pages with me, and she shared some of the photographs from Robert's time in the service. She also had Robert's war diary, and she shared that with me. And so I chose to sit on that for about 5 years until all my kids were in school and I had some space, because when you have young twins, there's not a lot of time to do much else than take care of your kids. But in 2010, I decided when they all started school that I was going to start a genealogy business. And I had a bucket list item, and that was to write one book, just one book. And I was going to write about Robert, because if you read any Flying Tiger history after the war ended, Robert is hardly mentioned anywhere because he died so soon after. So I wanted him to be remembered. So I began the journey into the research, and I published his book. And once I did that, then all my other relatives that were in service, that died in service or had died after they came home, showed up and said, well, now that you wrote about his story, you have to figure out how to do the research for the rest of us, because the word on the street back then was all the records burned, so you're not going to find anything else. And write our stories and then teach people how to do it. So in 2010, after I wrote that story, that's when my genealogy business began to start slowly changing. And by 2012, it was a full military research business. So what did happen to Ginny? Well, when Robert came back to Chicago in July of 1942, after the Flying Tigers had been disbanded, the war was full on and they needed service members. So Robert rejoined the Army Air Corps, and he was supposed to be stationed in Orlando to train pilots. The end of July 42, he toured the Hawthorne Works Western Lecture Plant, where Ginny was a Hello Charlie girl. And one of her duties was to be kind of a social hostess. And at the end of the day, after she'd walked around the plant with him and they had talked about with board members and other people about the Robert Rout Day parade on the 2nd of August, he asked her out for a cup of chai, and that started their romance. In October, Robert went to Orlando to start training pilots, and he and Ginny decided that they didn't want to be separated, so he proposed. And at the end of November 1942, they got married. 3 weeks later, on 19 December 1942, Robert's squadron was in Kissimmee for several days, and they were preparing to come back to Orlando. Ginny woke up that morning. She drove to the airbase, sat on the hood of her car, and watched the squadrons come in from Kissimmee. Robert's plane was in the lead in his formation, and Lieutenant Kane was right next to him on the right side. They were strafing the field, practicing this strafing, and they were only a couple hundred feet off the ground. Lieutenant Kane's plane, his wing, hit Robert's plane, and Robert's plane flipped and crashed. Lieutenant Kane's plane flew on just a little bit farther and crashed in a field. If you look at the Air Force accident report photos, which are on microfilm and they're kind of grainy, they're a little bit dark, Robert's plane looks like a pile of smoldering something. It doesn't even resemble a plane. Lieutenant Kane's plane resembled a little bit of something. Ginny watched the whole thing happen, and they told her that it was caused by an air pocket. At 20 years old, after 3 weeks of marriage, she became a widow. She went back to Chicago. Thousands of people who'd shown up for the Bob Brouk Day parade in August also showed up for Robert's wake and funeral. And then Ginny had to decide how she was going to live the rest of her life because all of her dreams had been shattered in that plane crash. So a few months later, on her 21st anniversary, or 21st birthday, Ginny decided to take up Robert's fight. And she joined the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps in April of 1943. At the minute, she turned 21, and it's in the newspapers, and she wore Robert's insignia. And her dream at some point was to go overseas. And at that point, with the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, that was not an option. But later in 1943, that was disbanded, and the Army created the Women's Army Corps, which then allowed women to re-enlist, and they had the option to go overseas. Ginny wanted to go to China, India, Burma, where Robert had served, but instead she went to Egypt. In Egypt, she had a very interesting experience, and she met her second husband, Harvey. She and the WACs landed in Egypt. Harvey was in the Army Air Forces, and he was helping the WACs come down the steps off the plane. Ginny was coming down. She had her musette bag on her shoulder, and she tripped. And as she tripped, her musette bag went flying off her shoulder and whacked Harvey in the face, knocked him to the ground. And she said he started swearing. And then he started to look up, and he saw her legs, and then he kept on looking up. And by the time he got to the top of her head, he decided he wasn't angry anymore. And he said, the least that you can do is have dinner with me. And that began the beginning of a 50-year romance. When I wrote my book, Stories of the Lost, I included Robert's story in that. I did modify it a little bit because I needed it to lead into The Tiger's Widow, which is Ginny's book. And when I asked Ginny if I could write her story as part of my Stories of the Lost series, she said, I didn't do anything. I wasn't a man with a gun on a front line, and I didn't do anything. And I said, well, you know, as a woman in that time, you took a chance, you joined the military, and like many other women, you stepped up and gave women of my generation other options to do more with our lives than the standard housewife, school teacher, nurse, secretary in the 30s and 40s. And we also now have the option to join the military. I said, and also in my Stories of the Lost series, it's not that lost doesn't mean I've lost my mind. It actually means what has been lost because of this trauma and this war. And for you, you lost the life with your husband that you thought you were going to have after just 3 weeks of marriage. When you read my other family members' stories in those books, a lot of them were young men who never had the chance to go to college. I wondered, did they ever fall in love? They never had the chance to realize their dreams. So they lost a lot of different things too. So she let me write her story. Now, when we write our family history stories, our personal stories, military stories, you can read every writing book, take every writing class out there, and they will say, create an outline, use your index cards, all of these different things. But my advice is to always be true to what the story wants to say. Even if it comes out, completely different from what your original intention was. When you listen to the characters and you listen to those voices of your ancestors that show up, healing can happen. And these stories can be a gift that keep on giving. Ginny's story has been one of those. Now, I wrote her book at the same time I was writing Stories of the Lost, which has 4 stories in it. And I did all my own self-publishing, all my own book layout. And the focus was to get Stories of the Lost out first. So I sent The Tiger's Widow off to my editor. And then when she returned it, after I got Stories of the Lost out, I spent a weekend going through the edits for The Tiger's Widow. And a very interesting thing happened. The book was no longer kind of a biography about her life. It became a love story. And I ended up in the book, which was never the intention. Her husband Harvey also took a more starring role, and his brother Fred that died. He was a co-pilot on a bomber that went down 2 November 1943 in Austria. And Fred has shown up quite a lot to have his story told. In fact, in my research books on how to do the military research, you can learn a lot about Fred. So what I would like to do before we move on to the next story is just to read you the very beginning of Ginny's story, just so you have an idea of what can happen when you honor what the story wants to be. So at the beginning of her book, the first chapter is called 5 Hearts Joined Together. Love knows no boundaries of time and space or life and death. It exists forever in our hearts as we remember and honor those who have gone before us, those whose memories we pass life lessons on to the next generation. We teach others there is light after darkness, hope after despair, and love is the glue that puts shattered hearts back together. This is a story of 5 hearts separated by time and space, hearts which would meet in the perfect moment. It is a story about never-ending love that lived on even after death. A famous pilot met a young beauty and the two fell in love, Robert and Ginny. Their love soared with the eagles. Their time together was brief, but they lived so fully in the moment, it is as if nothing but death could have broken them apart. Then death knocked on their door, and a plane fell from the sky in a fiery ball. One heart silenced on earth, but lived forever in death. One heart shattered into a million pieces. A year later, on another continent, 2 brothers fought a war, Harvey and Fred. The boys grew up as orphans and wanted a heart to come home to. Fred flew a bombing mission over Austria and was lost, listed as missing for a year. Harvey feared the worst and waited for word, which came a year after Fred went missing. A brother's love lived on after death. Less than a year after Fred went missing, Ginny found Harvey. A chance meeting and 2 hearts became one. Pieces of Ginny's shattered heart started to glue back together, slowly at first and then more quickly. Harvey's heart had finally found its home with Ginny. He was no longer an orphan or alone. They found each other during a time of war when the world around them collapsed in chaos. Together, they created a new world filled with joy, love, and the memory of those lost before their time. Almost 65 years later, another heart emerged, a young woman trying to start a new life after her heart was shattered. She and Ginny, now a widow for the second time, connected. Little did they know the impact that meeting would have. 5 hearts separated by time and space that met in perfect time would change the lives of all they touched. Their love would span decades. Their life lessons would provide hope to others in the future. 5 hearts joined forever. Now, while it's been 6 years since I wrote that book, every time I teach it, a new lesson shows up for me and I heal a little bit more on some level. And Ginny and I helped each other heal because in 2012, I moved out and got a divorce. And that was the first time I got to go and visit her. Now this year she'll be 99 and we've helped each other through a lot of things. And one of the biggest things on that first meeting was, as I said, they told Ginny that it was an air pocket that caused Robert's crash, but that's not really what happened. It was really that the 2 planes bumped. Ginny found a lot of peace and a lot of healing in knowing what actually happened, even 65 years later. And when we met, there were some tears because we were both grieving Bob. And I think some of you can probably relate that even though we've never met some of these people that we research and that we tell stories about, I often wonder, how is it possible to love somebody so much that I never met? And that's how I've always felt about Bob and all my soldiers. And Bob still today will bring new people into my life and new experiences, new avenues to explore. But he definitely got me started on what would become an amazing military career and to create a life outside of the US that I never ever thought I would have. So my next story is about James Provoznik. Now, James showed up in 2012, just after I moved out. And In 2010, when I started doing this military research and I was reading all of these death files, the World War I burial file, World War II IDPF, which is the individual deceased personnel file. That file is also in existence for Korea and Vietnam. I received James's files along with all my other family members, but James's story just didn't, I don't know, it didn't click with me at that point. So I put his files in a box. But in 2012, over Labor Day weekend, 4 people showed up asking me about James. Now, when a soldier or a family member wants you to pay attention, they are going to send people, documents, flares, whatever it's going to take to get you to wake up and take a look at what they want you to look at. And then it's up to us, do we want to go there? And sometimes there are stories that just take us years to start processing the different layers of before we can go there. But that's a story for another day. When James showed up that weekend, one of the people that contacted me was his nephew, also named Jim, and his father. They were interested in his death file, and they were interested in, I had a second copy of the lithograph of the Luxembourg Cemetery with James's grave on it, where he's buried. I also received emails from a missing in action researcher in Luxembourg who had seen my website and articles about James. And then I received an email from a man who's the 90th Infantry Division historian. James was part of the 90th Overseas, who wanted to learn a little bit about James, had some records for me, and also wanted to put me in touch with a couple in Luxembourg who wanted to unofficially adopt James's grave at the cemetery. Now, the American Battle Monuments Commission does not run grave adoption program, but for some, not all, World War I and World War II cemeteries, there are foundations that are set up. Most famous and well known is at Margraten in the Netherlands. It's been in existence since the temporary cemetery was created. But Luxembourg doesn't have a foundation that helps do grave adoption. So this couple in Luxembourg wanted to be in touch with family members, learn about James, and then just honor his grave on his birthday, on his death day, which is the 11th of January. He died in 1945. On Memorial Day, Veterans Day, whenever they were near the cemetery. So if 4 people showing up in my reality over a weekend was not enough to look at James's story, I don't know what is. So I started researching it. And James showed up along with my great-grandfather, Joseph, who is the brother of Michael, that I'll tell you his story at the very end, to help guide me. And as I started researching all of these different stories from my book, Stories of the Lost, and really started researching and writing Michael's, which again, I will tell you part of that at the end, it was very emotionally difficult. I cried a lot. That reading the death files was painful. But my great-grandpa basically said, well, you have 40 years of repressed emotions and you need a healthy way to deal with it. So you can either do this hard work and write these stories and learn how to do this and teach other people and work through your stuff, or you can become a serial killer. You know, it's one or the other. I mean, it's kind of a drastic choice, but you know, what are you going to do? So I chose the writing and the healing. And each one of my soldiers led me down a different path that helped create my business, my life, and help me heal. James might have had the most impact on all of it. When I started researching his story, my cousin gave me a big bag of stuff. Now, for all of my service members who were in the Army or the Army Air Forces, their service files burned. So I had to rely on a lot of other records. And if you pick up any of my research books, you take any of the classes that I teach online through my website, while they're World War II based, the strategies I teach, the records that you need to set the foundation for your research, the locations of those records are exactly the same for World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. So you can pick up one of my books or take a class and learn the process for all of them. And it's pretty much the same across every military branch. So it's much easier now to do the research and do it properly and get the answers that you need than it was several years ago. So with this big bag of stuff came some 90th Division books, some yearbooks, his Purple Heart. I did some research on the 90th Infantry Division website, had some newspaper articles. There was a nylon flag sent from the VA to his mother when he was temporarily buried in Luxembourg. And then pictured at the bottom of the screen in the original box that it came in was the flag that was on his casket when he was permanently buried in Luxembourg, and it has gold stars. His mother never took it out of the box. I was the first person to do that in 2013, and it was huge. It took up my entire bed and then some, so I tried to photograph it. Using all of this, I started to piece together James's story, and James was really good about putting out another puzzle piece every so often when I was ready for it. Like, okay, here's the next step, and here's what you need to tell people when they're ready to do the research. Some of those things were photographs. Now, when I did James's research, I used the morning reports, I used his death file, traced him from his death backward to February of 1944, as he was put into a replacement depot before he went into the 90th Division a few days later. Now, one thing a lot of people don't realize is when you're looking at a discharge paper, no matter what branch, no matter what war, that's probably not the only unit somebody was in. And if you take that unit on the discharge paper and you research that and you think that's the whole story, over 90% of the time you're going to be wrong. When you look at James's discharge, or you look at his cross at Luxembourg, or you look at his death file, it will say 358th Infantry Regiment, 90th Infantry Division. If I had only researched that, I would have had all but 14 days of his service wrong. He was only in that unit for 14 days because Patton needed rifle replacements during the Battle of the Bulge. The rest of his time overseas, he was in 790th Medium Maintenance Organization, and he was in a replacement depot right before he was placed into that, February 1944. Prior to that, I was stuck. The morning reports did not say where he came from, but in the big bag of stuff, there was a lanyard that once unrolled said 126th Medium Maintenance Battalion, Camp Butner, North Carolina, January 1944. So I was able to use that to go back through the morning reports and reconstruct his service to the beginning, and this was the only other unit he was in during that time. Another piece of his puzzle and the training and the service he had, there was a picture, you can see at the bottom here, that was in a frame, and I didn't take it out of the frame for months. Finally, when I did, I flipped it over on the back and it said Tennessee Maneuvers, August 1943. I don't know why August was listed as the month, because the 126th Medium Maintenance Battalion actually did Tennessee Maneuvers in April. And there are books on Tennessee Maneuvers and a lot of information that can help you understand what these war games were and when each of the different units that participated in these were part of that. There were also war games out in the desert and other places outside of Tennessee. So always check for that in case your soldier might have been participating in those trainings. Also, there were some unidentified photos, and 3 of them are grouped together over here. And this was really kind of exciting because I put a piece of the puzzle together that nobody in the family knew. We knew James trained at Camp Butner, North Carolina. And then I have these unidentified photos where he kind of looks like he's in some sort of Army training uniform, maybe. So I sent these pictures on, I think it was Christmas Day of 2013, to the newly formed Camp Butner Historical Society and said, you know, could you take a look? Do these look like the Camp Butner area? And they said no. So I sent the photos then to Paul Grasmere at the Pritzker Military Library here in Chicago and said, what do you think? And he said, well, it looks like a CCC camp, Civilian Conservation Corps. And the Army used those to train soldiers during World War II. He said, I'll pull some books. When you come in after the new year, you can take a look. So after the new year, I went to the library and I had already done some CCC website research, and I'm looking at these 3 photos of James and many others compared to the one where he's in his uniform, ready to go off to war. And I realized he looks younger in those other pictures. So I thought he must have not trained at a CCC camp. He must have worked for the CCC. Now those records are at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. And I contacted my researcher there and said, could you please request the file? Here's his social security number. Here's his name. Can we do this? He did. And a month later, he came back and said, nope, there are no records. Now, I was absolutely positive that James worked for the CCC. Everything told me in my heart and soul. And even he was like, no, you need to go back and have them redo the research again. I said, well, have them spell his name correctly this time. Go find a reliable archivist and ask them to search again. Within a few hours, I had 12 pages of CCC records. So always trust your gut and listen when you hear those whispers from your service members or your family, because they will tell you exactly where you need to go. So I put together another 6 months worth of James's life. And I sometimes wonder if his service and training and work with the CCC didn't maybe keep him off the front lines at first, but keep him in the ordnance company behind the lines for most of his service. I can't prove that, but it's a theory. One of the most important things James probably did among many lessons he taught me and all the places he walked with me, he took me to Europe. Twice after I moved out, my parents said, we would like to take you to Europe, show you these places that you've researched. But my kids were young. I hadn't been more than 6 hours away from them. And I thought, how could I possibly not work for 3 weeks that you want to take me out of the country? But after I published James's story in my book, Stories of the Lost, and wrote Ginny's book, and my research books were about to be released at the beginning of 2015, my parents offered one more time. And James and the universe screamed, yes, you have to go. And that trip completely changed my life. It completely changed my business. I met a lot of people that I knew on Facebook who were military researchers in Europe. I saw things I would have never seen had I not connected with some of them. And one of the primary reasons we went, and the goal for the end of the trip, after I'd seen everything else and had time to process some of that, was to go to the cemetery where James is buried in Luxembourg and fly his burial flag. So I made arrangements with the assistant and the superintendent there. And we showed up on the 1st of May. It was a rainy day, and flew his burial flag. The assistant superintendent brought Omaha Beach sand, and we put it on his grave. So I was able to take a lot of pictures of me with his flag and his book. And the next day, we met that couple from Luxembourg who unofficially adopted his grave, and they took me to the woods, as you can see pictured here, near Bras, Belgium, where James was killed on 11 January 1945. James kind of rearranged part of that trip after the first week we'd been in Normandy to have us walk the footsteps of the 90th Division through Europe, which was never the intention. And I had a lot of interesting things happen, a lot of spiritual things happen, a lot of healing happened on that trip. And later that afternoon, after we walked in the woods and we were back at the house of the couple that took us to the woods, my mom made a comment. She's like, Jenny really released a lot of baggage on this trip, and especially today. And that was true. And even walking in those woods, and I wrote it in my journal, there are a lot of times that this work is so emotional, so difficult, but we know we have to keep going, even though sometimes we want to stop, because it can become too much. It really can affect us emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually. And this is not something that researchers talk about. But in the woods that day, the soldiers were there, and they all said to me, thank you for doing this work. We need you to continue to do this work. So many people need to know how to tell these stories, how to do the research. So many people need to remember all of us who lost our lives and the ones that came back. So I continued, even though sometimes it's been really, really hard. James also influenced my love life, and I met somebody on that trip who would later introduce me to the man that I would meet in Europe and eventually marry. So that's a whole other story. Now, there are some people that show up in our lives that are not family members. They show up through stories. If you're a professional researcher, maybe they show up through a client, but they all have stories to tell us, things to teach us. And sometimes it's not always obvious, the healing that we have to do or the lessons we need to learn or what we need to take away from their stories or the project that we can pass on to others until much later. So 2 of those people are Johanna and Bill. Now, Johanna was a Dutch woman who survived the bombing of Rotterdam. And later she survived the Rotterdam hunger winter. She left her family due to a lot of personal reasons during the war and moved in with the family that would become her in-laws after the war ended. Because of everything she endured and the things that her husband would have endured, being rounded up in the razzia of November of 44 and being taken to forced labor, for several months. They both carried a lot of trauma. And having studied trauma and PTSD and inherited trauma for the last 6 or 7 years, because I've dealt with it, my clients deal with it, and speaking with a lot of people in Europe, especially children and grandchildren of people who survived, the trauma, whether you were in Europe as a soldier, whether you were a family member, whether you're an American coming home, the propaganda after the war around the world was shut up, don't talk about it, shove it down inside, it's time to rebuild. Whether that's your community, if you're in a place that was affected by the war, or you're in America where it's time to come home, you have the GI Bill, go to college, get married, start a family, get a job, don't talk about it. All of that not talking about it created a lot of inherited trauma for children and grandchildren. It affected the way the survivors of the war lived their lives. It affected the way they raised their children. And then sometimes these people will show up, if you're a medium or an empath or a little bit sensitive to this energy, they'll show up because they know that you can help them. And Johanna has done that quite a lot with me, asking often for forgiveness, trying to show me things that happened, help me understand some of these deeper layers of trauma. And some of it didn't make sense for me for a while, but as the last year has gone on and I've done more collective trauma healing study, it's starting to make more sense on how I need to help others with that. Another person that showed up was Bill, and he came through a client. Now, Bill made sure that his youngest brother knew about an article I wrote on Ancestry.com several years ago about military research. I don't even remember the exact article, and had him get in touch with me to do research. Bill died on the 13th of January, 1945, near Tiremont, Belgium, as part of the 30th Infantry Division. When Bill showed up for his younger brother and I to do the research, it began to lead me down another path that I didn't quite realize would affect me so much or my clients. It started to bring up topics of grief and loss, PTSD, inherited trauma, anger, all kinds of repressed emotions that we all feel. Sometimes we don't even realize it because it's unconscious. But my client lost his oldest brother during the war, and my client was a very young boy, and the family had a lot of difficult circumstances, as many did during the early part of the war. But Bill wanted to make sure that there was healing. And through the research that we did, we learned a lot about the family circumstances that the client didn't know, and also more about the father, which brought up a lot of anger and repressed emotions. And through some facilitation, we were able to work through that. We then researched the father, and then we also researched the other brother who served with the 10th Mountain in Italy and came home with severe PTSD. Through all of this research, it became clear that one of the paths that I would be on for myself, which I didn't realize was coming the next year, was to work through PTSD and being a caregiver and anticipated grief or grief in any form and trauma, and also help my clients because clients were showing up asking for it. Not all of them, but a lot of them are. So sometimes it's not family members that come to tell us their stories and help us heal ourselves, parts of ourselves, or other people. It's other people's family members, but yet we're all connected. And when those people show up, they're just mirroring back to us things that we still need to work on, whether it's conscious yet or not. And it's always a choice whether or not we start moving through that. So before we end today, I would like to tell you Michael's story. Now, if you read my book, Stories of the Lost, Michael's story is the first one. All 4 stories in that book are written very differently because I had access to different records. I knew different stories, I had different photographs. For my cousin Frank's 29th Division story, his is much shorter and takes on a very different tone than the others. In fact, in that one, I'm basically I wrote it as if I'm having a conversation with his parents in 1948, explaining all of these things that were kind of family myth that really didn't happen or that were questioned. But with Michael's story, while everything in the book has sources, footnotes, bibliography, you can reconstruct the research on all these guys. And even more research has come to light, been made public since I wrote this book I did channel quite a lot of Michael's story from his father, my great-great-grandfather Joseph, and Michael. So when I wrote it, it's a little bit of biography with a lot of sources, a little bit of his father Joseph's voice, a little bit of Michael's voice, and then his father's voice at the end. And so I would like to read you the end of Michael's story. And this one was very difficult for me to write. This is the first one I wrote where I was channeling and crying and processing. And my great grandpa basically said, you can do this or you can continue to suffer. And I can tell you, the more that we do our inner work, the more we tell these stories, the more we release these layers and family patterns, the easier it gets. And we are not so emotionally attached and suffering through all of these different stories. We can learn to set boundaries and do some better protection. So I'd like to end today with Michael's return. Now, Michael was a World War I soldier who was killed in France. It was friendly fire in the trenches. And he died in 1918, but his remains weren't brought back until 1921. And if you're not familiar with World War I and World War II and how they handled our war dead, when you died overseas, you stayed buried overseas until the war ended. And after both world wars, the government then gave families the option to return the remains or put them into an American Battle Monuments Commission cemetery overseas. Michael's parents chose to bring him back. And when I read his burial file, I sat in my bedroom and cried because his mother had 11 children, 10 of them survived, and 4 of them saw military service. 2 of them went overseas. Michael didn't come back. And I have 3 boys, and I thought, and they were all very young then, but I could feel my great-great-grandmother's pain, thinking, how would I feel if my boys went off to war? And I know times are very different now, and remains come home very soon if something happens, but how would I have dealt with it knowing my son was buried overseas and I never would know at what point do I get his body back? So every story, every record you read can bring questions, healing, emotions, and it's so important to not forget any of them. So this is the end of Michael's story as told in his father's voice. It is May 27th, 1921, and I wait on the platform at the rail depot listening for the deep thunderous rumble of the train coming down the track. Although there are many people waiting for this train and their dead soldiers, I feel isolated from them, alone and invisible. A slight breeze caresses my cheek as if to say, hello, you are not alone. The skies are cloudy and dark as if the heavens are preparing to shed their tears along with mine. I hear a distant whistle, a groan of thunder, and my heart cracking. The train and the pain are close like a storm about to explode in the sky. Today is the day my son arrives back from the war. He arrives not walking off the train, but carried off in a flag-draped casket. Dead almost 3 years now and buried in a foreign land. We did not know where he was buried for almost 2 years after he was killed. This was the land his mother and I left years ago. How ironic he should die there when we came here to give our children a life of hope, plenty, and most importantly, peace. The clouds gather close as the train arrives, slowly grinding its brakes as it grinds pain into my heart. Finally, the train comes to a stop. My heart stops too for a moment. The doors open in front of me as if in a dream, and soldiers march in formation off the train and stand guard in a present arms state outside the baggage car doors as the families wait silently. Breaths are held as we await the unloading of our soldiers, and I see tears silently sliding down the faces of some of the women as they place their hands on their hearts and bow their heads in solemn prayer. I feel their pain and my chest aches. It is becoming more difficult to hold back the tears. The grief I first felt when I learned of Michael's death has returned with a vengeance. It is as if the storm brewing in the air is brewing inside me, just waiting to be released. The grief consumes me as it explodes once again in my aching chest. Sadness seeps from me through the air to the boxes holding the caskets which carry the soldiers. Can the soldiers feel my pain? It's so real, you can almost touch it. Box after box is carried off the train and soldiers appear carrying my son. They place Michael's box gently on the floor next to the other boxes, which are laid side by side in the train station lobby. The soldiers await orders on where to transport the boxed caskets from here. Grief of all the men, women, and children standing in this room waiting to sign for their soldier is thick and oppressing like high humidity, and I can hardly breathe. I wonder how long this pain will last. I sign the receipt of remains for my dear son and give directions on where the casket should be delivered. I turn to depart the train station and leave a piece of my heart behind as I go. The next day, our dear son was laid in state at home in our parlor. His mother and I waited so long for this moment. Visitors filed into our home throughout the day on May 28th and paid their respects. There is no laughter in the house today. The grief filled the room, something we could have not have avoided no matter how hard we tried. May 29th, 1921 arrives, and soon it will be time to bury our son. It is a beautiful day, fair, sunny, and warm, and a white carriage stands in front of the house. The street is filled with family, friends, and neighbors, and men from all branches of the service enter the house to remove his casket. They load his casket in the white carriage, and a military band leads the solemn procession down 18th Place from our house. We follow the carriage in more than 12 cars and make our way north to Bohemian National Cemetery, where full military burial service is held. The white carriage stops next to the area where Michael will be buried, and a military chaplain awaits us. An honor guard acting as pallbearers gently extract his flag-draped casket from the carriage and carefully laid it next to the open hole which will serve as his final resting place. The chaplain begins speaking, although I hear very little of what he has to say. My thoughts rest on my dear son lying quietly in the casket at my feet. The chaplain finishes speaking, and a group of riflemen fires a salute. After the boom of the guns, an eerie silence descends upon us all. Then the mournful sound of a trumpet and taps is played. The family gathers close and sadness washes over us like an ocean wave. When taps is finished, the deathly silence envelops us all as the flag which covered Michael's casket was taken off and folded very precisely. With her heart shattering and head bowed as her tear-filled eyes are fixed on Michael's casket, his mother, Magdalena, weeps, the tears staining her cheeks. She raises her head and looks at the soldier standing before her with Michael's flag. She stretches out her arms to receive the flag, and pulling it close to her heart, she bows her head again and sobs, knowing she will never again hold her son. We say our last goodbyes as Michael is lowered into the ground and finally laid to rest. Maybe now that he is home with us, the pain will begin to subside. Maybe now we can all find some peace and begin to heal. The last of the dirt is placed upon the grave and people begin to depart. Our family stands there a bit longer to reflect on our dear son and his sacrifice, which allows us to live free and in peace. We are proud of our son and his service. As we walk away, I turn one last time to say goodbye to Michael. He was named after Michael, the archangel patron of protection and love. And our son now lies in a tall monument with a statue of an infantryman standing guard and protecting us all. I invite you, if you're not breathing, to just take a deep breath. I've told that story countless times, and it never fails to choke me up because Michael is always with me, especially when I tell that story. Standing guard and protecting. So I would like to thank you very much for attending today. And again, you can put the questions in the chat. If you are interested in learning more about how to do military research, there is a handout that is available with this program that has links to all my books, my websites, my classes, and I am getting ready to, in the next couple of days, launch registration for a class called Your Family's War Journey, where we're going to take a 7-week journey through one woman's story with the 9th Infantry Division and her healing process. And it's transformational masterclass. So if you're interested, you can always contact me or sign up on my website for the email blast and you'll be notified of that. So I will now turn it back over to Jim And I think we have some time for questions.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. We do have a few questions. One says, it sounds like if we just listen and pay attention, that we can make a connection with our ancestors, even without an intermediary. Could
Yes.
you talk more about this?
Yes, everybody has the capability of connecting with the ancestors. It's just a matter of being still, being quiet, and paying attention to the signs. Now, if you want one way to really start connecting with them, maybe on a deeper level, one of the ways that I started purposely connecting with them, there's a book called Ask Your Guides by Sonia Choquette. And in there, she talks about channeled writing. And I would just sit quietly with my journal. I would write a question at the top of the page, and I would just wait to see what would come through. Ancestors also show up, that little whisper that you hear, or genealogists will call it serendipity because a document shows up in their lap, or somebody will show up in their email or on social media saying, hey, have you looked here? Or I can introduce you to somebody. And then just feeling into the energy of what is showing up and how do you feel when one of your ancestors shows up, because many of them have a signature. My grandma Libby would show up as something purple, or I would smell her face powder. My great-grandpa Joe, I always felt overwhelming unconditional love, and I just wanted to cry tears of joy when he showed up. James was sometimes a little more subtle, although when I was in Europe, he made sure to whack me across the back of the legs at one point to, kind of pay attention to what's going on. But everybody has this capability. You just have to tune into it and be open to it.
Okay, well, you also mentioned, the stuff, especially when you were talking about the 90th Infantry Division, and you had photographs and, different books that related. And I just wondered, it, it may be a simple question, but is it easier to do the research when you have the stuff? And I'm sure for information purposes, but I guess what I'm asking is, can you connect more easily with your ancestors and those you're researching if you have items or things to assist in some way?
Sometimes, but that's not always been my experience. I've lived back and forth between here and the Netherlands for the last 5 years, and I was traveling a couple times the year before that. And I can be on a battlefield and connect with soldiers. I visited a lot of ABMC cemeteries in Europe, and even just walking to a grave, sometimes I will connect. There's actually in the Ardennes, I don't know if a lot of people know this, but there are some children, babies buried in some of the ABMC cemeteries. And in the Ardennes, in the very front, on the right, if you're standing all the way at the front of the cemetery, looking toward the chapel, on the right side, there's a little girl named Catherine Rothwell. She was an infant. She died of pneumonia. She has an IDPF, and her father was an American, her mother was French, and at the end of the war, nobody could contact the family, so ABMC made the decision to bury her there. And while I had seen her story, when I visited the Ardennes Cemetery, I'd totally forgotten she was not on my list, but we stumbled upon her grave, and her energy was amazing. I could see her, I could feel her, So yeah, you don't always have to have stuff. You just really need to be open to what's showing up and how it's showing up.
Very good. There's a couple more questions, but there are also numerous comments. So I'm going to share a few comments with you at this time.
Okay.
Yuri says, just wanted to say hello here, Jennifer.
Hi, Yuri.
Really touching to hear these stories. I also choked up during the last part about Michael. Wow, thank you. And that is, again, is from Yuri. Betsy says, Jennifer, your presentations are always insightful, moving, and inspiring. We get more than information. You go above and beyond to another level to help us process the emotions of it all. Thank you. And again, that's from Betsy. Becky says, how wonderful to keep the people alive in our hearts. Let's see. You also have one here. It says, thank you very much for a moving presentation. So there's lots of good comments coming in.
Another question I wanted to ask is, it's obvious you've done extensive research at different repositories and locations. Um, just for people starting out, where do you like to start? If you haven't done any family research before, what do you think a good best way, so to speak, is to begin your family research?
Well, if you're doing genealogy or military research, the best thing to do is just to start documenting everything you think you know. Every story you've heard, even if you think it is a complete tall tale, write it down. And even if you've heard multiple versions of that story from other family members, there's always a grain of truth in there somewhere. And then, since we're focused on military research here, there is a process to doing military research correctly so that you get the answers you need without wasting a lot of time and money. And basically, I encourage everybody to create a timeline. I do that in Word. I have 3 columns. One is a date column. One is a column where I put the unit somebody was in and maybe where they're stationed. And the 3rd column has notes, what is happening. And I always document every single thing I find, because the more research that we do, sometimes we find conflicting information because the military records are not always accurate, or sometimes they say different things than what we think they should or what we've heard from our family. So it's always good to know exactly where you got that information to then go back and look at it again with new eyes. I can tell you, I did research on a Marine who died at Tarawa named William Cowart. And when I had his IDPF, the first one I had, which wasn't scanned fully or properly, had a photo in it of another Marine, because Graves registration sometimes mixed up paperwork. And for months, I looked at that photograph and it did not hit me that the service number was wrong. It was not William's service number. But when we research, we often get so focused on that one question we want answered that if we're looking at a discharge paper and we want to know what unit he was in, sometimes we ignore everything else of value on that paper. So it's always good to document everything and then go back again and again and again and look at it with fresh eyes and see what else you can add to it.
I think you've answered this question, but it just says one answer often creates a number of new questions. Once
Yes.
you discover something, it leads to 5 new questions or more, and that take you in different directions. And the question actually was, how do you organize and prioritize your research? And it sounds like you just explained your organization. Anything about prioritization that comes to mind that you'd like to mention?
I tend to follow the energy of what's showing up. So if 2 or 3 things are calling for my attention, which one is screaming the loudest, maybe? Or where is the service member for the client or my family showing up and saying, you need to look here instead of there first? Because sometimes looking here will lead you down another path. So yeah, just whatever is screaming the loudest. And sometimes, while you may have 2 or 3 different things, when the world opens again and we can get back into the archives around the world, it's going to take time. So sometimes the best thing to do is get your request in or hire a researcher, and we can get the requests in. And while you're waiting for that information to come back, you start chasing down these other things that are calling out to you and see where they lead. And sometimes, you have to just tie a rope around yourself and jump into that rabbit hole, because you can just get lost when things start showing up. And sometimes the soldiers will just keep putting it right in front of you, minute after minute after minute. So yeah, you really have to just do what's calling to you first. But again, when the world opens, get your requests in or start working with those researchers, and then pursue those other things that you can outside of that while you wait.
Okay. Heidi asks, as an empath, how do you deal with all the big feelings that you may have in response to the trauma experienced by these soldiers?
That took me a lot of years to learn. And I'd say the first 5 years were definitely the hardest, because I didn't have the tools to put protection around me or clear my energy or even understand what was happening. And probably the thing that really woke me up is on my first trip to Europe, we were going around the southern part of Paris from west to east, headed out towards Saint-Avold. And I was in the back of the car, my parents were driving, and I had what people would call a panic attack. I had shortness of breath. I was nauseated. I had a headache. I had this feeling like something horrible was going to happen. My soul wanted to leave my body. I was claustrophobic, like I had to get out of this car, but I couldn't. And this lasted about a half an hour. And only after I had a spiritual mentor at the time, and she said, I feel like it's connected to World War I. But then after I came home from that trip and started processing those 3 weeks and everything that happened and reading my journal and writing some new things, did I start to connect? Well, it was more like a past life thing and the energy of what was happening there. That led me to start working with some energy healers and also to start reading and taking classes and learn, how do I clear my energy? How do I kind of protect myself sometimes? But again, the one big thing that has helped so much is the more inner work that we do and heal ourselves layer by layer. It's like peeling an onion, which frustrates a lot of people. A lot of people in my family are always a little bit irritated with me. Like, I thought you healed that. No, it's like an onion. We heal the top layer. And then when we can handle it physically, mentally, emotionally, the next layer shows up for us to look at. The more we do that, the more we can stand back and witness what's happening and what's coming up instead of taking it all in and being so emotionally destroyed by it sometimes, because it can destroy you if you're not careful.
Donna has a comment. She said, I have thoroughly enjoyed this. I look forward to working with you while researching my grandfather's World War II death. So thank you,
Great.
Donna, for listening in. Well, let me just check real quick and see if we have another question or two and make sure I didn't miss anything.
And the
yeah,
only other thing I'd like to say is, not only do I do the military research, but my business has very much shifted over the last 6 months more into the ancestral lineage healing and the personal healing. And that is where more of my time will be focused. And I do have some classes already out for that. I'm teaching more. I do one-on-one sessions. So there's a lot of different ways to connect. And my websites have articles. So lots of resources if people are interested.
And also Morgan did post a message in the chat in case anyone missed it about where to go to find your handout for today.
Yes.
At vawarmemorial.org/learn/live streams. So again, if anyone would like that resource, it is there. Well, I can't say thank you enough for this wonderful presentation. Just fascinating. And I hope you'll join us again in the future and share more of these stories and where your research leads you. So thank you so much, Jennifer, for being with us.
Thank you so much. And I do hope to come back.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, I'm going to go ahead and just tell you about our upcoming program that's on the screen. 76 years ago, our nation was still in the midst of fighting the Battle of the Bulge. Join us on Tuesday, January 12th at 2 p.m. for a conversation with World War II combat infantryman Warren Fisher as he discusses his experience in the struggle to stop Germany's last offensive battle of World War II. Well, thank you to everyone who's been listening to our live stream broadcast, Learning from the Home Front. To learn about additional upcoming live streams and to view previously recorded programs, visit our website at vawarmemorial.org/learn/livestreams. Please reach out to us if you have any further questions. Thanks again for listening and have a wonderful day.